Hello, and in this part 2 video I'm going to describe something that you made and gave to someone, and in it you should say what it was, who you gave it to, when you gave it to them, and explain how you felt about it. Now, I found this quite a difficult topic to think of anything that I've made, but I've chosen to talk about a cake. Don't worry if you're not a good baker and you've never made a cake in your life. This is something you can talk about if you haven't made anything else. When I first read this question, I couldn't think of anything that I have made and given to someone, as I'm not a practical person and I'm not into making things. However, suddenly I remembered that I once made a cake for my friend. I can't remember precisely when it was, but I think it was about 3 years ago. She was going through a rough period in her life. She had finished university and was struggling to get a job in her chosen field, which is journalism. She was really down, and I wanted to do something to cheer her up. I knew that if I took her out for a meal, she would be embarrassed because she couldn't afford to pay for herself, and she would be annoyed if I offered to pay. So I had to think of something else that didn't cost money. That's when I came up with the idea of making her a cake. I'm not a particularly good cook, and the recipe I chose was rather challenging. It was a 3-layer chocolate cake, and each layer was a different chocolate: white, dark and milk. Between each layer there was a chocolate mousse, which was a bit tricky to do, but I managed it. Then the outside of the cake was covered in chocolate. By the time I finished, I was covered in chocolate as well. As soon as I finished it, I took it round to her house because I wanted her to try it when it was freshly made. When she opened the door and saw me standing there with this huge and delicious-looking creation, she burst into tears. I thought this was a slight overreaction, but she then said she had just received a phone call with a job offer and was so overwhelmed by that and my cake. I was so pleased I had made the cake, and instead of cheering her up, we celebrated her new job with coffee and cake. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the language. My answer for this is quite long and it's probably over 2 minutes. You don't need to message me and tell me that. I always try to do them as long as I can because you're not going to remember everything, and I don't want you to remember these word for word, but I want you to remember all the different things I talked about to try and get those in your answer so that you have an answer that's around 2 minutes. So when I first read this question, I couldn't think of anything that I have made is a good opening sentence to this answer. I'm not a practical person. A practical person is a person who's very good at doing practical things. Practical things means making things, using your hands to do things. I'm not into making things, means I don't really like. And when we use I'm not into or I'm into, we follow it with an ing verb. I'm not into making things. I can't remember precisely, so don't say it was 3 years ago, because this is a much more complex way of saying it. I can't remember precisely when it was, or I can't remember exactly when it was. We've got some good grammar in this answer. She was going through. When somebody is experiencing a bad time, she was going through a rough period in her life. A rough period means a bad period. She had finished, the past perfect, because this had already happened. And she was struggling to get a job. She was finding it difficult to get a job in her chosen field, which is journalism, which is just a fancy way of saying as a journalist in her chosen field. She was really down. This is a good way to describe somebody who's low, not quite as strong as depressed, but if you feel down, you feel low, you feel sad. And I wanted to do something to cheer her up. To cheer up means to feel better. To cheer somebody up means to make them feel better about something. But I knew she'd be embarrassed. This is when you feel uncomfortable because of a situation. In this case, she didn't have the money to pay for it, so she feels embarrassed because she couldn't afford to pay for herself. Afford to means to have the money to do something. So I came up with the idea of, just a fancy way of saying I decided to, I came up with the idea of, and it's followed with an ing verb, of doing, of making her a cake. So instead of saying I'm not a very good cook, I'm not a particularly good cook. The recipe, this is the thing that you follow, the instructions for cooking something, the recipe. It was challenging, it was difficult. And when you think about cakes, we talk about them in layers. So a 3-layer means there are 3 separate pieces of cake piled on top of each other, and each layer was a different chocolate. And when we talk about chocolate in English, we have white chocolate, we have dark chocolate, which is the one without the milk in it, and it's quite bitter, but it's very healthy and good for you. And then the milk, which is the much sweeter chocolate. And between each layer, so between each one of these cakes, there was a chocolate mousse. And a mousse is a kind of cream, often made with eggs and cream and chocolate. So it's not just a cream, it's a bit more complicated, a bit more difficult than that, a chocolate mousse. And it was tricky, it was difficult. And very useful for talking about a cake or something you've made. It was covered in, so I've used the passive here. Freshly made, so it's fresh and I've just made it, so we can describe it as freshly made. A delicious looking creation. Anything that you make, you have created it, so we can call it a creation, and it was delicious looking. She burst into tears. When somebody just starts crying and you're not expecting them to, they burst into tears. And I thought this was a slight overreaction. An overreaction is when somebody reacts in a way that you're not expecting, and it was only a cake and she burst into tears. So I thought that was an overreaction. But it was because she'd received this phone call and she was overwhelmed. When you feel overwhelmed, it's like a big rush of emotions. You're feeling quite emotional about something in a good way, kind of happy that she'd got the job, and here I was with this cake. So I was so pleased I had made the cake, past perfect, because I'd made it before I arrived or before I knew that she had got the job. And instead of cheering her up, so in place of making her feel better, when we use instead of, we follow it with an ing verb. So instead of cheering her up, instead of doing, instead of having, and that will help with your grammatical range and accuracy grade. So hope you found this useful. Like I said, it's quite a tricky topic, so just using a cake, I found there's a lot more to talk about than anything else I could think of that I may have made in the past. So I would recommend you thinking about something in terms of food, because there's a lot more language that you can use connected with food. Thanks for watching.